Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1. The Garden Party. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the neatly trimmed lawns and well-manicured hedges of Mrs. Celia Darlington's estate. The sounds of polite conversation and gentle laughter floated through the air, blending with the sweet fragrance of summer flowers. It was a quintessential afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind of event that the villagers had grown accustomed to. Mrs. Darlington's annual garden party, an affair that had become a fixture of the local social calendar. The guests, all respectable members of the village, had gathered in the large garden behind Mrs. Darlington's imposing house, surrounded by towering oaks and delicate rose bushes. They sipped tea from fine porcelain cups, nibbling on cucumber sandwiches and small pastries, discussing everything from the weather to the latest gossip. It was a time to relax, to celebrate the ordinary pleasures of life, and perhaps, for some, to indulge in a little harmless chatter about their neighbors. But Miss Jane Marple, though seated in the corner of the garden, sipping her tea in silence, was not one to be fooled by appearances. Her sharp eyes were always observing, always noting the subtle shifts in behavior that most people overlooked. She had lived long enough to understand that even in the most seemingly innocent of gatherings, secrets and lies were never far from the surface. As she watched the guests interact, Miss Marple noted the way some of them behaved with a certain discomfort. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, the village's leading socialite, chatted with her usual poise, but her eyes kept darting toward the far end of the garden, where a solitary figure stood by the large oak tree. It was Philip Darby, a relatively new arrival in the village, and someone who had clearly ruffled a few feathers since his move to St. Mary Mead. Philip Darby was an outsider, one who had only recently moved to the village from London. He was a tall, dark-haired man with a strong presence that made others take notice. He had the air of someone who was used to being listened to, a man who carried a certain weight of authority, even if he wasn't yet fully accepted by the village's old guard. His past remained shrouded in mystery, and though his charm and confident manner had won him a few friends, there was a palpable undercurrent of suspicion from the longer-established residents. Miss Marple had observed him at previous gatherings, and it was clear to her that Darby was a man who didn't mind stirring the pot. She had seen the way he interacted with people, his questions always probing a little too deeply, his comments just sharp enough to make others uncomfortable. And yet, he was always polite, always careful not to reveal too much about himself. This, Miss Marple knew, was often a sign of someone with something to hide. But it wasn't just the newcomer who had caught Miss Marple's attention. There was something else at the party that seemed off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The usual rhythms of village life, those familiar gestures, the polite exchanges, had all taken on a certain stiffness today. There was tension in the air, though no one was willing to acknowledge it openly. A secret, Miss Marple was certain, was waiting to be uncovered. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation shifted to the usual topics: the latest births, marriages, and the state of the village gardens. But there was a lingering undercurrent of unease, something that made Miss Marple uneasy herself. She caught snippets of conversation, fragments of words that seemed too pointed, too knowing. "Too much of a mystery," she overheard Mrs. Ashford muttering to her companion, a remark that seemed directed at Darby. "He's bound to stir up trouble." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. She could hear the whispers, the subtle hints of discomfort. Mrs. Ashford's remark, in particular, stood out to her. It was too casual, too pointed, to be mere gossip. The kind of comment that suggested someone knew more than they were letting on. The sound of a woman's sharp laugh interrupted her thoughts, and Miss Marple looked up to see Mrs. Blakesley, the widow of a local businessman, laughing too loudly at a joke shared with a man nearby. There was something about Mrs. Blakesley's laugh that seemed forced, as though it were covering up something more serious. It wasn't the first time Miss Marple had observed such behavior in the widow, but today it seemed particularly noticeable. Her eyes darted nervously as she glanced around, though she quickly masked it with another smile. Miss Marple knew that this was not the sort of village gathering where deep secrets would readily emerge. People were too careful here. But she also knew that every gathering of people, no matter how innocent it seemed, was a performance. And like any good performance, the smallest gesture, the fleeting glance, the half-hearted laugh, revealed more than words ever could. It wasn't until the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the garden, that the true disruption occurred. There was a sudden, sharp scream that cut through the evening calm, and the guests froze, their laughter dying in their throats. The scream came from the direction of the house, from Mrs. Darlington's study, where the door had been left slightly ajar. At first, no one moved, unsure of whether it was part of some elaborate joke or an accident. But then, the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps followed by another scream sent the guests scrambling toward the source of the disturbance. Miss Marple's sharp mind immediately went to work. The scream was unmistakable. Genuine terror. Not the playful kind that sometimes accompanied a garden party prank. She watched as the others rushed toward the house, but she remained calm, her steps slow and deliberate as she made her way toward the study. Something told her that this was no accident. Something told her that Philip Darby, the outsider, was at the heart of this disruption. And sure enough, when Miss Marple entered the study, she found him there, on the floor, his body, sprawled in an unnatural position, a pool of blood spreading around him. The letter opener, once a decorative piece on Mrs. Darlington's desk, was buried deep in his chest. The party, once filled with light and chatter, had been shattered in an instant. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew that the game had begun. Someone in this village, someone she had observed so carefully, was hiding a secret. And that secret had just turned deadly. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The scene in Mrs. Darlington's study was chaotic. The body of Philip Darby lay sprawled on the floor, blood pooling around him, a disturbing contrast to the delicate furnishings and bright afternoon light filtering in through the windows. Mrs. Darlington was in a state of shock, her hand pressed to her mouth as she stared at the body, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding before her. Other guests had gathered in the doorway, their faces pale, murmurs of disbelief filling the air. Some moved away from the study, unsure of what to do, while others hovered uncertainly, waiting for someone to take charge. Miss Marple, always composed, stepped forward, her gaze sweeping the room. The first thing she noticed was the letter opener, a sharp, ornate blade that seemed out of place among the other more innocent items on the desk. It was clearly the weapon that had been used to end Philip Darby's life, but Miss Marple knew better than to make assumptions. She needed to understand the context, to piece together the subtle clues that would reveal the truth. "Mrs. Darlington," Miss Marple said gently, her voice calm amidst the hysteria. "Please, sit down. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you a few questions." Mrs. Darlington nodded absently, sinking into a chair by the window, her face pale and stricken with grief. Miss Marple could see that she was struggling to maintain control, but she wasn't entirely overcome by her emotions yet. She would be able to speak. I don't know what happened, Miss Marple," Mrs. Darlington said, her voice trembling. "I heard a scream, and when I came into the study, he was lying there." "I understand," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "But I need to know. Was Mr. Darby alone in the study when you heard the scream? Did anyone else come in or out of this room?" Mrs. Darlington shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. At least, I didn't see anyone. Philip was— well, he was different today. He was so quiet, so distant. He kept to himself most of the time. But then I heard the scream, and I rushed in. And he was—" Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing through the possibilities. Mrs. Darlington's words were troubling. Philip Darby had been acting strangely, keeping to himself. Was it because he had discovered something he shouldn't have? Or was there another explanation? The fact that no one had seen anyone entering or exiting the room raised more questions than it answered. "Thank you, Mrs. Darlington," Miss Marple said softly. "Please, try to rest. I'll speak with the others." As she stepped out of the study, Miss Marple turned to the gathered guests, who were now in a flurry of conversation. Several of them had retreated to a corner of the room, while others lingered near the doorway, exchanging nervous glances. The village, so accustomed to calm and order, was shaken to its core by the brutal murder of an outsider, a man who had only just begun to make his way into their lives. Miss Marple took a deep breath. She needed to speak with everyone who had been at the party to see if any of them knew something about Philip Darby's past, something that could explain why someone would want to kill him. She knew the villagers well, their secrets, their habits, and while many of them appeared perfectly harmless on the surface, Miss Marple had learned over the years that appearances were often deceiving. First, she approached Mrs. Ashford, the village's grand matron, who had been standing near the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple said gently, her tone calm but probing. "I understand this is difficult, but I need to ask you something. You and Mr. Darby had spoken earlier, hadn't you? Was there anything in your conversation that seemed unusual?" Mrs. Ashford, always the picture of composure, blinked at Miss Marple, her brow furrowed in thought. "We spoke, yes. Nothing in particular. Just pleasantries, I believe. He had been quite distant lately, though, more so than usual. But we exchanged a few words about the garden, and that was it." "And did he seem concerned about anything? Anything at all that might explain his actions today?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ashford hesitated. "Now that you mention it, there was something odd. Just before the party began, he was very agitated, almost as though he had something on his mind. But I didn't think much of it. He had a way of brooding, I suppose." Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Brooding. That could explain why Darby had been keeping to himself. Had he discovered something about his past? Or perhaps had he realized something about the village? "Thank you, Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. "Please, stay close. I'll need to speak with everyone." Miss Marple moved on, her thoughts still swirling. As she spoke with the other guests, she gathered more snippets of information, most of it unhelpful, a lot of it speculation. Yet there was a pattern emerging. Darby had been a quiet presence at the party, but his demeanor had been markedly different that afternoon. And the way people had reacted to him, a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and subtle suspicion, was enough to make Miss Marple wonder what Darby had been hiding. One guest in particular, Mrs. Blakesley, the widow of a wealthy local industrialist, caught Miss Marple's attention. She had been standing near the back of the room, speaking with Mr. Darby just moments before the scream. Miss Marple had noticed how her eyes had shifted nervously when the police began questioning the guests, as if she were hiding something. Miss Marple approached her. "Mrs. Blakesley," Miss Marple began, her voice measured but inquisitive. "I understand you spoke with Mr. Darby just before the murder occurred. Do you remember what you were discussing?" Mrs. Blakesley's eyes widened for a moment before she quickly composed herself. "Oh, we just spoke of trivial things, Miss Marple. Nothing of importance." "Nothing of importance?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "How curious. I understand you've known Mr. Darby for some time. Was there anything unusual in his behavior today?" Mrs. Blakesley's lips tightened slightly, and Miss Marple noticed the faintest tremor in her hands. He was quite preoccupied, I suppose. He kept asking about my late husband's affairs, about old documents, things of that nature. But I didn't think anything of it. Philip was always curious, always asking questions. Miss Marple observed her carefully, noting the subtle nervousness. Mrs. Blakesley had not been forthcoming. There was more to this conversation than she was willing to admit. "I see," Miss Marple said softly. "Thank you, Mrs. Blakesley. I may need to speak with you again." As Miss Marple stepped back, the pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture was still far from clear. There was something more, something that tied Philip Darby's sudden and violent death to the village's hidden past. Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that the answer lay not in the present, but in the long-buried secrets of the past. As the police arrived to take charge of the scene, Miss Marple lingered for a moment longer, her mind racing with the details she had gathered. She knew it would be a long road ahead, but she was determined to uncover the truth. For in St. Mary Mead, as in every village, the truth had a way of hiding in plain sight, and Miss Marple was always there to find it. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The murder of Philip Darby had thrown the village into disarray, but for Miss Marple, it was simply another puzzle to be solved. She had always found comfort in untangling the threads of human behavior, no matter how twisted the web. The village of St. Mary Mead, though picturesque and seemingly peaceful, was like any other, full of secrets and half-truths, and Miss Marple had long understood that the truth was rarely found in the obvious places. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple made her way to her small cottage. She had been observing, listening, and collecting what little information she could. But the pieces of the puzzle were still not fitting together. Something was missing, something subtle but essential, and she needed to find it before the mystery spiraled further out of control. The next morning, Miss Marple decided it was time to pay a visit to the local constable, who had begun the initial investigation, but had already made a few assumptions that Miss Marple found troubling. Constable Pierce was a well-meaning man, earnest in his desire to keep the peace, but he often lacked the depth of insight that Miss Marple had gained over the years. The constable had quickly concluded that the motive for Darby's murder was likely a personal one, some romantic entanglement gone wrong or a financial dispute that had escalated. But Miss Marple knew that this kind of reasoning rarely led to the truth. When Miss Marple arrived at the constable's office, she found him going through some papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his face creased with concern. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a slight nod. "I was wondering when you'd stop by. There's been no shortage of chatter in the village since the murder. I've been speaking to a few of the locals, trying to piece things together." "I'm sure you have," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral though her eyes were sharp. "And I'm sure the villagers are offering their theories. But, Constable, I wonder if they're all looking in the right direction." Pierce shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What do you mean?" "It's clear that Mr. Darby's death was an isolated incident. He didn't know anyone in the village well, but there was a rumor that he had a disagreement with a few people at the party." "Rumors," Miss Marple murmured. "Rumors often give us the shape of a story, but they rarely provide us with the truth. I've spoken with a few of the guests myself, and while I agree there was some tension at the party, I'm afraid the explanations being offered don't account for the bigger picture." The constable glanced at her, clearly intrigued but also uncertain. "You think there's more to this?" Miss Marple took a seat across from him, her fingers gently tapping on the armrest of her chair. "I do. I think the key to understanding Mr. Darby's death lies not in the event itself, but in the past, specifically in the secrets he was uncovering." "Secrets?" Pierce repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Philip Darby was no ordinary guest at the party," Miss Marple began, her voice steady and measured. "He was a man with a mission, and though no one knew exactly what he was searching for, he was clearly probing into something. A family history, perhaps? Or a matter tied to someone in the village? Something that had been hidden for years, waiting to be discovered." Miss Marple paused, watching the constable closely. He didn't immediately respond, clearly absorbing the weight of her words. "Now, Constable," she continued, "I know you've already spoken with Mrs. Darlington and Mrs. Ashford, but there's something else I need to ask you. Have you looked into the possibility that someone in this village might have had a strong reason to keep Mr. Darby quiet? I mean, a reason that would go beyond mere personal conflict?" Pierce hesitated, and Miss Marple could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I don't know, Miss Marple. The obvious suspects, the ones who seemed most affected by his presence, are already being questioned. But you may be right. We might be missing something." Miss Marple nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's always the things that seem the least important that are often the most revealing. I've noticed something. That might prove to be helpful." "Something you've noticed?" Pierce leaned forward, his interest piqued. "A clue of sorts," Miss Marple said. "It's not much, but I believe it could hold the key to understanding why Philip Darby was murdered." Pierce leaned back in his chair, waiting for her to elaborate. Miss Marple's eyes wandered for a moment, as though recalling something in her mind. "The night before the party, I happened to see Mr. Darby walking through the village, near the cemetery. He wasn't acting like someone who was simply out for a stroll. He seemed preoccupied. He stopped by the grave of Mr. Darby's father. It struck me as odd at the time, but now I wonder if there's more to it." "The cemetery," Pierce repeated. "That's an odd place to be before a social gathering." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her gaze thoughtful. "Mr. Darby was not just visiting the grave of his father. There was something else about that visit, a purpose behind it. It wasn't about honoring the deceased. It was about finding something, perhaps a piece of information that was crucial to the mystery." Pierce looked up at her, his brow furrowing. "So you think his death has something to do with his father's past?" "I do," Miss Marple replied. "I believe Philip Darby was uncovering something hidden in his family's past, something that could have had serious consequences for the present. And I suspect that someone in this village, someone who knew the truth, couldn't allow that to come to light." The constable nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of doubt and curiosity. "I'll speak with the others again," he said. "Maybe it's time to take a closer look at Mr. Darby's family, see if we missed something." Miss Marple stood up, her eyes sparkling with the satisfaction of a puzzle slowly coming into focus. "I'm certain you'll find what you're looking for, Constable, but I'll warn you, take nothing at face value. What people say isn't always what they mean, and sometimes the truth is buried so deep that it takes someone with a steady hand to pull it to the surface." With that, Miss Marple left the constable's office, her thoughts already turning to the next step of her investigation. She knew that the murder of Philip Darby was not the end of the story. It was simply the beginning. The village had its secrets, and she was determined to uncover them all, one by one. Chapter 4. First Suspects. The days following Philip Darby's murder were filled with unease in St. Mary Mead. The village, so accustomed to tranquility, was now buzzing with whispered theories and darkened glances. The small-town rhythm had been broken, and though many of the villagers still clung to their everyday routines, there was a palpable sense of unease in the air. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred by the mounting tension. She had long learned that in times of crisis, the people closest to the scene often had the answers, whether they were aware of them or not. The key was not to force the truth out, but to wait for it to reveal itself in the most unsuspecting of moments. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept a careful eye on the villagers. She spoke to them casually, as though she were just another guest in the village, but her questions were always pointed. She noted the smallest shifts in tone, the faintest hesitation when certain names were mentioned, and the slight changes in posture that revealed discomfort. She had already spoken to Constable Pierce, but now it was time to turn her attention back to the suspects, the people who had been closest to Philip Darby in life, and who might now have the most to lose. The first person on her list was Mrs. Ashford. As the village's most prominent socialite, she was always in the thick of things, and Miss Marple knew that she had been one of the last to speak to Darby before the murder. Her conversation with him, as Miss Marple had gathered, had been brief but laden with significance, and now, in the aftermath of his death, Mrs. Ashford's behavior seemed more than just the natural reaction of a grieving acquaintance. There was something else beneath the surface, something Miss Marple intended to uncover. Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Ashford's home, a large and imposing house on the edge of the village, surrounded by manicured lawns and high hedges. As she walked up the steps to the door, Miss Marple felt a small shiver run through her. There was an air of formality about Mrs. Ashford's residence, a sense of order that felt artificial in the wake of the recent tragedy. The door opened almost immediately after Miss Marple rang the bell, and Mrs. Ashford appeared, her face a mask of polite concern. Her eyes were tired, but she smiled warmly enough as she invited Miss Marple in. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to stop by. I imagine you have many questions. Please, come in." "I'm afraid I do have some questions, Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple replied gently, following the woman into the drawing room. The room was as immaculate as Mrs. Ashford's reputation, with polished furniture, expensive paintings, and a faint smell of lavender in the air. "Have you heard anything new from the constable?" Mrs. Ashford asked as they sat down. "I've heard a few things," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the room, noting the small details. "But it's the things people don't say that are often most revealing." Mrs. Ashford's lips pressed together for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, I suppose you're right. It's just, I can't believe this is happening. Poor Philip. He was so new to the village, so eager to fit in. It doesn't make sense." Miss Marple observed her closely, noting the slight tremor in Mrs. Ashford's hands as she poured the tea. She was nervous, though she was trying her best to hide it. There was something about Mrs. Ashford's words, too, the way she spoke about Darby's attempts to fit in. Could it be that she felt threatened by his presence? After all, Mrs. Ashford had always been the undisputed queen of St. Mary Mead's social scene, and any newcomer who tried to disrupt the balance might cause her some discomfort. "You knew Mr. Darby better than most, I believe," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but probing. "You must have had many conversations with him. Did he ever say anything that seemed out of the ordinary?" Mrs. Ashford hesitated, her eyes flicking away from Miss Marple's gaze for a brief moment. "No, nothing. Nothing unusual, at least. We talked about the village, the gardens, his work in London before he came here. It was always pleasant." "But was there something about his presence in the village that caused you any discomfort?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice gentle, but insistent. "He was an outsider, after all, and people in a village like this, well, they're always a bit wary of newcomers." Mrs. Ashford's smile stiffened. "I wouldn't say I was wary of him. I simply didn't know him well enough to form an opinion. I welcomed him as I would anyone new to St. Mary Mead, but I suppose it's true. He was not like the rest of us." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Not like the rest of you? I see. And do you think that's why someone might have wanted to harm him? Perhaps someone who felt threatened by his presence?" Mrs. Ashford's eyes widened, and she quickly placed her teacup down on the saucer with a soft clink. "What do you mean by that, Miss Marple? I don't believe anyone would have gone that far. Sometimes people do terrible things for reasons that seem trivial to others," Miss Marple said gently. "But it's the smallest of details that can lead us to the truth. I'm simply trying to understand the bigger picture." Mrs. Ashford's hands trembled slightly, and Miss Marple noticed her carefully maintaining her composure. It was clear that the woman was hiding something. Whether it was guilt, fear, or simply the discomfort of being questioned, Miss Marple wasn't sure. But she knew that Mrs. Ashford's involvement in the matter was far from over. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple," Mrs. Ashford said, after a long pause. "I don't know what else to tell you. I'm sure the constable will uncover the truth." "I'm sure he will," Miss Marple agreed, standing up. "But I'm afraid I'm not so certain. There are many layers to this case, Mrs. Ashford, and it's often the layers that people try to hide that reveal the truth." As Miss Marple left Mrs. Ashford's home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was closing in on something significant. Mrs. Ashford's unease was unmistakable, but it was the subtle hints of something unsaid that intrigued Miss Marple the most. She had barely scratched the surface, and already there was something deeply suspicious about the woman's involvement. Miss Marple's next stop would be to speak with Thomas Mallory, the solicitor who had worked with Darby. There was no doubt, in Miss Marple's mind, that he held the next crucial piece of the puzzle, and she was certain that he would not be as cooperative as Mrs. Ashford had tried to be. There was more to this mystery than met the eye, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover every last hidden secret. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself standing in front of the unassuming office of Thomas Mallory, the local solicitor. Though Mallory had been polite in their previous encounters, Miss Marple had always sensed a wariness about him, a guardedness that suggested there was more to his role in Philip Darby's life and death than he was letting on. His involvement with Darby, particularly regarding the family papers and the inheritance, was something Miss Marple had yet to fully unravel. But she was certain that Mallory knew more than he had revealed, and it was time to press him for the truth. The office was small but neatly kept, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large oak desk in the center of the room. Mallory sat behind it, his sharp eyes flicking up as Miss Marple entered. His greeting was cordial, though there was a slight tightness to his expression. "Miss Marple," Mallory said, offering her a seat. "I trust you are well?" "I'm as well as one can be under the circumstances, Mr. Mallory," Miss Marple replied, settling herself into the chair opposite him. "I trust you've been keeping busy in light of recent events?" Mallory gave a noncommittal nod, his hands folding neatly in front of him on the desk. "The village is understandably in a state of shock. Philip Darby's murder has been a tragic event for all involved." Miss Marple studied him closely. She had seen the way his eyes darted to the side when he mentioned Darby's death. It was subtle, but it was enough to tell her that there was more to Mallory's feelings on the matter than simple sorrow. "I'm sure it has, Mr. Mallory," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but probing. "But there is something I would like to ask you about. You mentioned previously that you had assisted Mr. Darby with some legal matters, family affairs, I believe. I was hoping you could shed some light on the nature of your dealings with him." Mallory's expression remained neutral, but Miss Marple could see the slight tightening of his jaw. "Yes, Mr. Darby came to me seeking advice about some old family documents. It was nothing unusual, simply a matter of reviewing a few papers related to his inheritance." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "An inheritance, you say? I believe there was some mention of documents that could have been troubling for the family. Is that correct?" Mallory shifted in his seat, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face, before he regained his composure. "I would rather not discuss the specifics, Miss Marple. It was a private matter between Mr. Darby and his family. I have a professional obligation to keep such matters confidential." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Of course. But surely, Mr. Mallory, you can understand why I'm asking. There seems to be more to Mr. Darby's death than a simple tragedy. He was uncovering something connected to his family's past, and I believe it's more than just a legal matter. Was there anything Mr. Darby found that might have led to his untimely demise?" Mallory's fingers tapped against the desk, the rhythmic motion betraying his anxiety. For a moment, he didn't speak, his gaze shifting downward. Miss Marple waited patiently, knowing that silence often prompted people to reveal more than they intended. Finally, Mallory spoke, his voice low and measured. "Mr. Darby was very insistent on uncovering the truth about his father's past. There were documents that suggested, well, there were financial dealings, some that were not, above board, but I can't say for certain what he intended to do with the information." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Financial dealings? What kind of dealings?" "I don't know the full extent of it," Mallory continued, "but it involved some business ventures from years ago, ones that, if exposed, could have destroyed the family's reputation. Philip seemed determined to uncover the truth, despite the risks. He was a curious man, always seeking answers, no matter where they led." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. So, Darby had been on the brink of exposing something more than just a family secret. There were financial transactions involved, ones that could have caused scandal, even ruin. The timing of his death then seemed more than coincidental. Someone had wanted to stop him from uncovering the truth. "And you didn't think that his investigations might have put him in danger?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but pointed, that someone might have wanted to stop him from finding. Out more? Mallory's face tightened, and he quickly stood, pacing for a moment before turning to face Miss Marple. I told him to be careful. I warned him that digging into old business could stir up trouble. But he didn't listen. Philip was obsessed with uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. Miss Marple observed him closely. And you didn't think you might be in danger too, Mr. Mallory? If these papers, these financial dealings, were so damning, surely someone would have been willing to go to great lengths to keep them buried. Mallory's eyes flickered, and for the briefest of moments, Miss Marple saw something shift in him, a fleeting sense of guilt or fear, quickly masked by his usual controlled demeanor. I did what I could, Miss Marple. I only provided legal counsel. I had no idea it would lead to this. Miss Marple stood up, her mind already processing the information. She had learned something important today. Philip Darby had been digging into his family's financial history, and he had uncovered something dangerous, something that could have ruined more than just his father's legacy. But Mallory's reaction had been telling. He was more involved in this than he let on, and his attempt to distance himself from the situation only raised more questions. "Thank you, Mr. Mallory," Miss Marple said, her tone polite but firm. "You've been very helpful, but I believe there's still much more to uncover. The truth, as always, is hidden in the smallest of details, and I intend to find it." As Miss Marple left Mallory's office, she felt a growing sense of urgency. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was still much work to be done. Mallory had confirmed what she had suspected. There was more to Philip Darby's murder than a simple conflict, and the more she learned, the more convinced she became that the village's hidden past was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Chapter 6. A hidden clue. The more Miss Marple dug into the mystery of Philip Darby's death, the clearer it became that the young man's investigation into his family's past was not only the key to understanding his murder, but the catalyst for it. She had suspected that someone in the village had a deep interest in keeping certain secrets buried, but now she knew that these secrets were tied to a much larger and more dangerous web, one that stretched back far further than anyone had imagined. The missing piece was somewhere out there, hidden in plain sight. But Miss Marple wasn't quite sure where it would lead her. She was beginning to piece things together, yet she still felt like she was missing something small but vital. The hidden financial dealings, the strange behavior of the villagers, and the subtle discomfort when Philip's name was mentioned had all pointed her in the right direction. But the precise motive, the exact person who had wanted him dead, was still elusive. After speaking with Thomas Mallory, Miss Marple felt the need to return to the scene of the crime, Mrs. Darlington's estate. There was always something about a place where a crime occurred that held the most profound answers. The atmosphere of the location, the smallest of details, could often reveal more than any direct testimony. Miss Marple was keen to look again at the study where Philip's body had been found. The police had already cordoned off the area, but, as usual, Miss Marple had a way of gaining access without causing alarm. She was known to everyone in the village, and her calm, steady demeanor often put people at ease, exactly what she needed for the delicate work of investigation. The study was eerily still when Miss Marple entered. The large oak desk stood as it had been left, its surface neatly organized. The blood stain on the floor, where Darby had fallen, was the only real sign of the violent crime that had taken place. Miss Marple knelt beside the spot where the body had been found, her eyes scanning the room with methodical precision. There was something about the way the room had been left that struck her, almost as if the murderer had been in a hurry, but not entirely panicked. Her gaze shifted to the papers on the desk, scattered in a haphazard fashion, though they didn't appear to have been disturbed much. Philip's letters, some accounts, and legal documents. Nothing that seemed out of the ordinary at first glance. Yet, something about the way they were placed intrigued her. The papers near the corner of the desk had an odd creased edge, as though they had been recently handled or moved. Miss Marple carefully picked up the pile of papers, examining them one by one. There was nothing immediately revealing about them, no hidden messages or notes, but then she came across a thin envelope that had been tucked discreetly behind a legal document. Its edges were frayed, as if it had been opened and closed repeatedly. Miss Marple's fingers traced the outline of the envelope, and then, with a slight breath of satisfaction, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an old receipt, yellowed with age, the writing barely legible but still readable. The receipt seemed innocuous at first, a transaction of some sort. But then Miss Marple's eyes caught the words near the bottom. Payment for shares in the Darby estate, to be paid in full by August 15th, 1923. Miss Marple's mind raced. A transaction. The Darby estate. She hadn't noticed any mention of this before, but now the name Darby seemed to echo in her mind. Was it possible that the financial dealings Philip had uncovered were tied to something much older than his father's generation? The mention of shares in the estate suggested an investment, a long-standing arrangement that could have extended beyond the immediate family. This wasn't just a story of inheritance. It was about power, influence, and perhaps greed. She studied the receipt more carefully, her mind working to place the piece in the puzzle. There had to be a connection between this old transaction and the people Philip had been speaking to in the village. The shares, the date, it all seemed too calculated, too precise to be an accident. But the name on the receipt, an individual connected to the estate in some way, was what held Miss Marple's attention now. The date was significant. It was an odd coincidence that someone in the village had been killed just as these long-forgotten dealings had resurfaced. The question now was who had been involved in this transaction and who stood to lose the most if it came to light. Miss Marple's fingers lingered over the receipt, her thoughts racing. The people she had spoken to, the ones who had seemed so nervous, so defensive, were they more connected to these transactions than they had let on? Could this old financial exchange be the key to understanding why Philip Darby had been murdered? A soft knock at the door broke her concentration. She turned toward the sound, a sense of clarity beginning to form in her mind. "Miss Marple," the voice of Constable Pierce called from the other side. "We've found something that might interest you." Miss Marple stood up slowly, carefully tucking the receipt back into the envelope and slipping it into her coat pocket. She had a feeling that whatever Pierce had discovered, it would confirm what she already suspected, that Philip Darby's death was not a simple case of anger or jealousy, but a deliberate act to silence a man who had stumbled upon secrets too dangerous to be uncovered. As she opened the door and stepped out to meet the constable, Miss Marple could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. The threads were finally beginning to weave together, but the full picture was still out of reach. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was always hidden beneath layers of deception, waiting for the right person to uncover it. And now, it seemed, the time had come for her to uncover it all. Chapter 7. Confrontations and Secrets. The morning following her discovery of the receipt in Philip Darby's study, Miss Marple sat quietly at her cottage, carefully examining the document. The faded receipt mentioned a transaction tied to the E.V. Darby estate, and the mention of shares made it clear that Philip's murder wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about something far deeper, something hidden in the past. Miss Marple knew that if she could trace these dealings, she would find the key to unlocking the mystery of Philip's death. As she pondered the possibilities, there came a soft knock at the door. It was Constable Pierce, looking both eager and hesitant. "Miss Marple, I've found something that I think you'll want to see," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. Miss Marple followed him outside, where he led her to a quiet corner of the village green. There, sitting on a bench, was a man she had not expected to see, Thomas Mallory. The solicitor looked uncomfortable, his normally composed demeanor now strained. He was holding a small, leather-bound notebook, the edges frayed as though it had been handled frequently. "I'm afraid Mr. Mallory has some information that might be of interest to you, Miss Marple," Pierce said, stepping back to allow Mallory to speak. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she took in Mallory's agitated state. He had seemed calm and measured during their earlier meeting, but now there was something different about him. The sight of him clutching that notebook seemed almost symbolic, like he was holding on to something tightly, unwilling to let go. "What is it, Mr. Mallory?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but inquisitive. "I assume you've come to share something important?" Mallory looked down at the notebook, his fingers brushing over the cover. He took a deep breath before meeting Miss Marple's gaze. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Philip's investigation into his family's past," Mallory began slowly. "I've been trying to protect the Darby family's legacy for years, and I can't continue hiding things any longer. Not now. Not after what happened." Miss Marple remained silent, watching him carefully. She was certain Mallory was about to confess to something important, but she didn't want to push him too quickly. The timing had to be right. "I've kept these records hidden, Miss Marple," Mallory continued, his voice tinged with guilt. "Documents that Philip discovered during his research, things he never should have seen. His father's dealings were far more complicated than I let on. The family estate wasn't just about inheritance. It was built on a foundation of questionable financial maneuvers that have affected many people in this village." Miss Marple's interest peaked. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to come together. Philip's death was tied to his investigation, and Mallory had been involved in keeping the truth hidden. The mention of questionable financial maneuvers was key. These were the things people were willing to kill to protect. "Why didn't you tell me this before, Mr. Mallory?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice calm but with an edge of steel. "If you knew the truth, why keep it hidden?" Mallory swallowed hard, clearly struggling with his conscience. "Because the truth is dangerous, Miss Marple. People would do anything to protect the legacy of the Darby family. Those who were involved in these dealings are still in the village, and they are not above using violence to keep their secrets safe. Philip knew too much, and that's why he was killed. I should have warned him, but I didn't." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The financial dealings, the shared history between the Darby family and other key players in the village, and now Mallory's admission that the murder was not just a personal dispute, but a matter of self-preservation for those involved. "I see," Miss Marple said slowly. "And you believe that Philip's murder was committed to stop him from revealing these dealings?" "Yes," Mallory replied, his voice strained. "He was getting too close, and I feared it would all come out. I've spent years managing the Darby family's legal affairs, keeping everything under wraps. But Philip was different. He had the kind of determination that made him dangerous to the people who wanted to keep these secrets buried." Miss Marple's gaze hardened. "And now, what do you think will happen with these secrets?" Mallory looked down at the notebook in his hands, and Miss Marple could see the weight of the decision pressing on him. I don't know. I kept records of the transactions, the documents that Philip uncovered. But if they're made public, the consequences will be severe for many people in this village. Not just the Darbys, but others who were involved in these dealings. A chill ran through Miss Marple as she processed his words. The village, which had always appeared so quaint and peaceful, was built on a foundation of secrets. And now, those secrets were coming to light, threatening to unravel the very fabric of the community. But Miss Marple knew she had to press on. The murder of Philip Darby wasn't just a crime, it was a symbol of the desperation of those who would stop at nothing to keep their past hidden. "I believe it's time we spoke with some of the other villagers, Mr. Mallory," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "The time for secrets is over." Mallory looked at her with a mixture of apprehension and relief. "Do you think we'll find the truth, Miss Marple?" "We have to," Miss Marple replied softly, "because only by exposing the truth can we bring justice to Philip Darby." As Mallory handed her the notebook containing the hidden records, Miss Marple took it with a quiet thanks, her mind already turning over the next steps. There was much more to uncover, but the trail was now clear, leading her toward the final confrontation. The time for shadows was over, and Miss Marple would see the truth laid bare. Chapter 8. Another twist as the morning sun cast long shadows across the village of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the revelations that had come to light over the past few days. The investigation into Philip Darby's murder was starting to reveal a complex network of secrets, financial dealings, and hidden histories that reached much further than she had initially imagined. And now, with the receipt she had found in the study and the confession from Thomas Mallory, it seemed that the heart of the mystery was growing clearer. But Miss Marple knew from experience that there was always another layer to uncover, another twist to the tale. After her conversation with Mallory, she had a clearer sense of the web of deceit that surrounded the Darby family and the village. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up. Mallory had confessed to his involvement, but his motives seemed incomplete. If Mallory had been trying to protect the family's legacy, why had he only just come forward now? There had to be something more. Miss Marple decided it was time to speak with a few more of the villagers. Her instinct told her that the truth was far more layered than a mere inheritance dispute. Someone in the village had far more to lose than they had been willing to admit, and it was time to find out who. Her first stop was Mrs. Blakesley, the widow who had been notably evasive when Miss Marple had questioned her previously. Mrs. Blakesley had a reputation for being charming, but Miss Marple had seen the subtle signs of discomfort in her actions. The way her eyes darted nervously when Darby's name came up, the way her laugh had sounded a little too forced. These were the signs of someone who knew more than they were letting on. Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Blakesley's home, a large, imposing house that looked out over the village green. It was clear that Mrs. Blakesley had been one of the village's wealthiest residents, and like many who had enjoyed that kind of status, she was used to getting her way. Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Blakesley had known Philip Darby better than she had let on, and her relationship with him was worth investigating. When Miss Marple arrived at the house, the butler opened the door and led her to the drawing room where Mrs. Blakesley was seated by the fireplace. She looked up with a well-practiced smile, but Miss Marple noted the subtle tightness in her posture. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Blakesley greeted her, her voice smooth. "How kind of you to visit. Is there anything I can do for you?" "I'm afraid I have more questions for you, Mrs. Blakesley," Miss Marple said gently, taking a seat across from her. "I know it's been a difficult time, but I must ask, what was your relationship with Mr. Darby? I understand that you spoke with him quite a bit before his death." Mrs. Blakesley's eyes flickered, a brief look of unease passing over her. face before she quickly masked it with another smile. Oh, Philip and I exchanged pleasantries now and then. He was new to the village, and we often discussed the garden or the weather. He was always so intense, though, always asking questions, probing into things. Miss Marple watched her closely. What kind of things, Mrs. Blakesley? Nothing in particular, she replied, but there was a slight quiver in her voice. He was just a curious man, always poking into other people's business. Sometimes it felt like he wanted to know things that weren't any of his concern. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And did you ever discuss anything of importance with him? Perhaps his family? His past? Mrs. Blakesley's expression faltered for just a moment. It was a subtle shift, one that could easily be missed by someone less attuned to such things, but Miss Marple caught it. Not really. As I said, we talked about small things. He didn't seem to want to get too personal, but I suppose it's true that he was interested in things others would rather not discuss. Such as? Miss Marple pressed, her voice soft but insistent. Mrs. Blakesley shifted uncomfortably in her seat. He seemed to have an interest in some of the older affairs of the village. I don't think he meant any harm by it, but he asked questions about the Darby estate, about its history. You know, some of those old financial matters, things that were never talked about. I thought it was odd, but I never thought it would lead to anything. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind processing the information. Mrs. Blakesley had just confirmed what she had suspected. Darby hadn't been just a casual observer in the village. He had been digging into matters that others wanted to remain hidden. But what had he found, exactly? And who had wanted to stop him from uncovering the truth? And do you think that's why Mr. Darby was killed? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Blakesley's hands twisted in her lap, her gaze darting nervously around the room. I don't know. It's all so terrible. He was only trying to find out the truth. But sometimes, Miss Marple, the truth is dangerous. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Blakesley's. Is it possible that someone in this village, someone you know, might have wanted to keep those truths hidden? Someone who felt threatened by Mr. Darby's questions? Mrs. Blakesley hesitated for a long moment, her lips pressed tightly together. Finally, she spoke in a hushed tone. I don't know, Miss Marple. I truly don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. There are some things in this village that are better left alone. People have their secrets. Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing as she processed the conversation. It was clear that Mrs. Blakesley had known more than she was willing to admit. She had just provided Miss Marple with another piece of the puzzle, Darby's investigation into the Darby estate and the old financial matters was the key to understanding his murder. And someone in this village had gone to great lengths to stop him from exposing the truth. As Miss Marple stood to leave, she turned to Mrs. Blakesley one last time. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Blakesley. I may need to speak with you again. Judith, widow's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she said nothing more. Miss Marple turned away, her thoughts swirling. She was closer now, closer than ever, to uncovering the truth. But as she made her way out of the house, she knew that there was still much to uncover, and that the final revelation would be far more shocking than anything she had imagined. Chapter 9. The final test. As the investigation progressed, Miss Marple's mind began to form a clearer picture. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, were starting to align in a way that made sense. The secrets surrounding Philip Darby's murder, tied to the Darby family's financial dealings and hidden histories, had been carefully guarded for years. But Miss Marple knew that the truth was always there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to uncover it. She had found the key players: Thomas Mallory, Mrs. Blakesley, Mrs. Ashford, and now, she suspected, several others. But there was one more step to take, one final test to confirm what she had already surmised. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself standing in front of Mrs. Ashford's house once more, a feeling of quiet determination settling over her. She had already spoken to the widow briefly, but now it was time to confront her more directly. Miss Marple had gathered enough information, but the final confrontation would allow her to piece everything together and draw out the truth. Mrs. Ashford greeted her at the door with her usual impeccable manners, though there was something slightly more guarded about her this time. It seemed as though she had been expecting this meeting. The tension in the air was palpable, but Miss Marple kept her expression serene as she entered the drawing room. The decor, as always, was flawless, but Miss Marple had learned not to trust appearances. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything, Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple said, as she sat down in the plush armchair across from the widow. "Not at all, Miss Marple," Mrs. Ashford replied, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. "How may I help you today?" "I've been thinking more about Philip Darby," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but steady. "I've spoken to several people in the village, and I can't help but notice a pattern. There's a great deal of discomfort whenever his name comes up. And you, Mrs. Ashford, seem to have known him better than most." Mrs. Ashford's fingers tightened on the teacup she held, but she quickly composed herself. "I told you before, Miss Marple. Philip was new to the village. I didn't know him well, not really." "But you did speak with him often," Miss Marple persisted. "And from what I understand, you and he had some interesting conversations, especially regarding the Darby family estate." Mrs. Ashford stiffened, her eyes briefly avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. The brief flicker of guilt in her eyes didn't escape the detective's notice. "I told you before, Miss Marple. Philip was very interested in the estate, and of course he asked about the history of it. But that's all it was. Just conversation." "Just conversation?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward slightly, her gaze steady. "You see, Mrs. Ashford, I've come to understand that there was far more to Philip's interest in the estate. He was asking questions about the financial dealings that went back generations, things that were never meant to see the light of day. And now he's dead. And I can't help but wonder if that's not connected to what he found." Mrs. Ashford paled at Miss Marple's words, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a slight tremor in the woman's hands. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "I'm implying that you knew more than you let on about Philip's investigation," Miss Marple said softly, her voice calm but piercing. "I believe you were aware of the documents he uncovered, the financial dealings that could have ruined the Darby family's reputation. But I also believe that you weren't the only one who knew about these secrets." Mrs. Ashford's face remained expressionless, but Miss Marple could see the struggle behind her eyes. It was as though she were trying to hold on to something she feared would slip away if she allowed herself to admit the truth. "I've spent a long time in this village, Miss Marple," Mrs. Ashford said after a long pause, her voice quiet but steady. "I've seen the damage that secrets can do. But sometimes those secrets are necessary to keep things running smoothly. What would happen if the truth came out? It would ruin everything. The village, the people in it, all of us would suffer." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. "Mrs. Ashford, I understand that you may have thought you were protecting the village, but there's a cost to keeping secrets. Philip Darby was a man who believed in finding the truth, no matter how painful. And because of that, he paid with his life. Mrs. Ashford's face crumbled slightly, her composure faltering for a moment before she regained control. "You're wrong, Miss Marple," she said, her voice wavering. "It wasn't just about the Darby family's reputation. It was about protecting everyone in this village. There are things that go back decades, things that no one should have to relive. And someone in this village was willing to kill to protect those secrets," Miss Marple said, quietly. "But the truth always finds its way to the surface, Mrs. Ashford, no matter how deep it's buried." For a long moment, Mrs. Ashford sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple waited patiently, knowing that sometimes the truth needed time to be revealed. Finally, Mrs. Ashford looked up, her face pale. "I never wanted this, Miss Marple. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. But Philip was too persistent. He wouldn't stop until he uncovered everything. And when he did, when he found out what was really hidden, well, I knew it was only a matter of time before someone had to stop him." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Someone in this village, perhaps." Mrs. Ashford's lips trembled, and she nodded reluctantly. "Yes, someone had to protect the past. The past can't be undone, Miss Marple. If it comes to light, everything will change." Miss Marple stood up, her expression resolute. "The truth will come to light, Mrs. Ashford. It always does. And when it does, those who tried to bury it will have to face the consequences." As Miss Marple left Mrs. Ashford's house, she felt a sense of finality settling over her. The pieces of the puzzle had come together. Philip Darby had been murdered not just because of his investigation, but because someone in the village was desperate to protect a long-buried past. And now, Miss Marple was certain that the final confrontation was imminent. The veil of deception was lifting, and the truth was within reach. Chapter 10. The Reveal, the village of St. Mary Mead, had always been a place where people prided themselves on their quiet lives and long histories. It was a community where secrets were kept behind well-maintained fences, where everyone knew each other, and where one's reputation was perhaps the most valuable thing to protect. But as Miss Marple walked down the cobblestone streets toward the village hall, she felt the weight of the truth pressing against her chest. The time for whispers and secrets had ended. The truth was about to be exposed, and those who had hidden it would have nowhere left to run. Miss Marple had spent days piecing together the fragments of Philip Darby's life and death. The key had always been in the Darby estate, the financial dealings, the buried history. And now, thanks to the confession of Mrs. Ashford and her careful observations, Miss Marple understood exactly what had happened. Philip Darby had uncovered the village's most carefully hidden secret, one tied to the old financial transactions that had been passed down through generations. His death had been a direct result of someone wanting to keep that secret buried forever. Miss Marple had gathered the necessary pieces, and now, with the help of Constable Pierce, it was time to confront the people responsible. The village hall was quiet when she arrived, and the few villagers who had gathered for the final confrontation looked apprehensive. The air felt thick with tension, as though everyone knew that today would bring a revelation none of them were prepared for. As Taras, Miss Marple entered the hall, the murmurs quieted and all eyes turned toward her. She didn't flinch under the scrutiny. She had been in the center of such moments before. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the key players, Mrs. Ashford, Thomas Mallory, and Mrs. Blakesley, all of whom were already seated in the front row. Their faces were tight, with nervous anticipation, their postures stiff with the weight of knowing that the truth was about to be revealed. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you are all aware of the terrible events that have unfolded over the past week. Philip Darby's death has shaken us all, but it is also an opportunity for us to confront the past, a past that has been buried far too long." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room was still, every eye fixed on her. Miss Marple continued, "We've all heard the rumors, the whispers of old financial dealings, of secrets kept to protect reputations and preserve legacies. But let me tell you this. The truth is never as simple as we'd like it to be. The truth, when uncovered, can destroy the very things we hold dear. And for some in this village, that is a price too high to pay." She turned her gaze to Thomas. Mallory, who was sitting at the back, his fingers nervously tapping the armrest of his chair. "Mr. Mallory," Miss Marple said, her voice now carrying a weight of certainty, "you were Philip Darby's solicitor. You helped him uncover the old documents, the financial transactions tied to the Darby family's legacy, and you knew exactly what he was digging into. But you also knew that if those secrets came to light, everything would change. The Darby family's reputation, the future of many people in this village, all of it would be at risk." Mallory shifted in his seat, his face pale as he looked down at his hands. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple turned to the others. "Mrs. Ashford," she said softly, her eyes locking with the village's most prominent socialite, "you were as much a part of this as anyone. You knew that Philip was digging into the past, asking the kinds of questions no one should ask. And while you may have wanted to protect your reputation, there were others who would have gone to any length to stop him. Your silence allowed the secrets to fester, to grow dangerous, until they had no choice but to come to the surface." Mrs. Ashford's lips trembled, and for a moment Miss Marple could see the facade cracking. The carefully constructed persona of the village's beloved matron was beginning to crumble. Finally, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Blakesley. The widow had remained silent throughout the proceedings, but Miss Marple had known from the beginning that she was more involved in this than she had let on. The way she had reacted to Philip's questions, the way she had deflected and avoided Miss Marple's inquiries, there was something about her that had always seemed just a bit too guarded. "Mrs. Blakesley," Miss Marple began, her voice unwavering, "you, too, were aware of Philip's investigation. You knew about the family's business dealings, the long-buried financial transactions that could have destroyed everything. You thought you were protecting the village, but in truth, you were protecting your own interests tied to the Darby estate and the secrets that had been carefully buried for years." Mrs. Blakesley's face remained expressionless, but her eyes were wide, and her lips parted as if she were about to speak. She didn't, though, and Miss Marple knew she wouldn't. The truth had already been laid bare. The murder of Philip Darby was no ordinary crime, Miss Marple continued. It wasn't a crime of passion, nor was it a personal dispute. No, it was a calculated effort to silence a man who had uncovered the truth. The people in this room, Mr. Mallory, Mrs. Ashford, and Mrs. Blakesley, are all part of the web of secrecy that led to his death. There was a long, pregnant silence in the room. No one spoke. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, as though waiting for Miss Marple to provide the final confirmation. She gave them no such luxury. "The truth is simple," Miss Marple said, her voice growing firmer. "Philip Darby was murdered because he knew too much. He had uncovered the financial dealings, the old payments, and the legacy of deceit that no one wanted to reveal. and those who killed him did so to protect their own interests. The Darby family estate was never just about inheritance. It was about power, and those who had the most to lose made sure Philip paid the ultimate price for uncovering the past. Miss Marple turned to Constable Pierce, who had been standing silently at the back of the room. "Constable," she said, "I believe the arrest of those responsible is long overdue." Pierce nodded and stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, his hand moving to his belt where the cuffs were clipped. "Thomas Mallory, Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Blakesley, you are all under arrest for the murder of Philip Darby and for conspiring to keep the secrets of the Darby estate buried. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the constable moved toward the suspects, Miss Marple watched with a quiet satisfaction. The village of St. Mary Mead had finally faced its truths, and though the people in the room were about to face the consequences of their actions, Miss Marple knew that, for once, the secrets would no longer haunt the village.